Sometimes the very thing we're running from is exactly what we need to find. Deep in the abandoned Carpathian mountains of Romania, where winter winds carry the whispers of forgotten villages, Dr. Elena Varga discovered 15 wolves dying in the snow. For 300 years, she had lived as both vampire and healer, a contradiction that tortured her undead soul. The mining town of Ravazitul had been her sanctuary, a place where she could tend to wounded animals without questions, feeding them drops of her own blood to save their lives while fighting the monster she'd become. But these wolves were different. As she carried each starving creature into her hidden sanctuary, Elena noticed something unsettling about the largest male. His golden eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, almost familiar. He watched her with a knowing gaze that made her century-old hands tremble as she fed him, drop by precious drop, never knowing she was healing the most powerful vampire in existence. The question that haunts this story: what happens when the healer meets the killer, and neither knows who the other really is? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena's hands moved with practiced precision as she checked the pulse of the smallest wolf, a female barely more than a pup, whose ribs showed starkly beneath matted grey fur. The underground sanctuary's warmth was a stark contrast to the howling blizzard outside, where temperatures had plummeted to lethal depths. Ancient mining tunnels, reinforced with her own careful renovations over decades, now housed makeshift medical stations filled with injured wildlife. The scent of wet fur and disinfectant mingled with something else, something that made Elena's vampire senses recoil. Death. It clung to these wolves like a second skin, and she wondered if even her blood would be enough this time. "Easy, little one," she whispered, her Romanian accent softening the words as she prepared a syringe. Not with medicine. She'd exhausted her veterinary supplies weeks ago when the supply truck stopped coming to the abandoned region. Instead, she filled it with her own blood, the crimson liquid that had saved dozens of creatures over the past century. The irony never escaped her. A monster, healing with the very essence that made her monstrous. As she worked on the smaller wolves, Elena's gaze kept drifting to the largest male. He lay apart from the others, his massive frame taking up nearly half of her main examination table. Even emaciated, he was enormous, easily twice the size of any wolf she'd encountered in these mountains. His coat, beneath the ice and malnutrition, would have been magnificent, deep black with silver threading through it like moonlight on water. But those eyes, those impossible golden eyes that tracked her every movement with an awareness that made her skin crawl. Wolves were intelligent creatures, but this was different. When she'd found him partially buried in a snowdrift, those eyes had fixed on her face with such intensity that she'd actually taken a step back. For a moment, she'd wondered if she was looking at another vampire, but the heartbeat, weak as it was, proved otherwise. Vampires had no need for such human functions. Elena finished with the smaller wolves, watching as her blood worked its way through their systems. Within minutes, color began returning to their gums, their breathing steadied. The ancient magic that coursed through vampire blood was a mystery even to her, but she'd long ago stopped questioning the miracle of it. Now for the largest male. She approached him slowly, the way she would any wild predator, but he made no move to flee or attack. He simply watched her, his head lifting slightly as she drew near. The intelligence in his gaze made her fingers hesitate over her medical kit. "You're not like the others, are you?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. As if in response, his ears flicked forward, a gesture too purposeful, too human-like to be coincidental. Elena shook her head, dismissing the thought. 3 centuries of isolation were clearly taking their toll on her sanity. She was seeing patterns where none existed, finding humanity in creatures that possessed none. It was a dangerous road for someone trying so desperately to hold on to her own. She prepared another syringe, drawing her own blood with the same clinical detachment she'd cultivated over decades. The wolf's eyes followed the movement, and she could have sworn she saw something flicker across his features. Recognition? Understanding? Impossible. "This will help," she said, moving closer. "I know you can't understand me, but I need you to trust me." The wolf's massive head tilted slightly, and Elena's breath caught. The gesture was so distinctly thoughtful, so deliberately communicative, that for a moment she forgot to breathe entirely. Her hand shook as she reached toward him, expecting him to snap or pull away. Instead, he remained perfectly still, allowing her to inject the blood into his shoulder. His gaze never left her face, and Elena found herself studying him with growing unease. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't place what. The shape of his features, perhaps, or the way he held himself with such regal bearing despite his weakened state. It reminded her of someone, but the memory danced just beyond her reach, like shadows at the edge of candlelight. As her blood entered his system, the wolf's eyes briefly closed, and Elena could have sworn she heard him sigh, a distinctly human sound of relief. She jerked her hand back, heart hammering unnecessarily in her chest. Vampires didn't need rapid heartbeats, but old habits from her human life still surfaced during moments of stress. "What are you?" she whispered. The wolf's eyes opened again, meeting hers directly. For one terrifying moment, Elena felt as though she was being evaluated, not by a wild animal, but by something far more ancient and infinitely more dangerous than herself. Then the moment passed, and he was simply a wolf again, injured, starving, dependent on her care. Elena stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warmth of the sanctuary. Outside, the wind howled through the abandoned mining equipment, a sound that had become the soundtrack to her self-imposed exile. But tonight, for the first time in decades, she wondered if her isolation was about to end. Elena remained motionless for several heartbeats, studying the wolf's face in the flickering lamplight. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with questions she couldn't voice and answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. Finally, she forced herself to turn away, busying her hands with cleaning the empty syringe. "You need rest," she said, though whether she was speaking to the wolf or herself she couldn't say. The routine of caring for injured animals had become her anchor over the past century, the one constant that kept her tethered to something resembling purpose. She moved through the familiar motions now, checking pulse rates, adjusting blankets, ensuring water bowls were filled. But her awareness kept drifting back to the large male, whose breathing had already begun to strengthen as her blood worked through his system. As dawn approached, Elena retreated to her private chambers deeper in the mountain. The mining tunnels extended for miles through the Carpathian peaks, and she'd spent decades converting sections into a proper living space. Her bedroom was sparse but comfortable, carved directly from the mountain stone and lined with thick tapestries that muffled the endless wind. No windows, daylight had been her enemy for 3 centuries, though she'd learned to tolerate brief exposures when necessary. She settled into her reading chair, a leather-bound veterinary journal in her lap, but the words blurred before her eyes. This was her existence, sleeping through the days, tending her animals through the nights, and maintaining the careful isolation that had kept her sane since 1847. No contact with other vampires, no involvement in their politics or territorial disputes. Just her, the mountains, and whatever injured creatures found their way to her door. It was a half-life, she knew, safe but hollow, purposeful but lonely. The abandoned town of Ravasitul stretched above her sanctuary like a ghost of her former world. Once, it had bustled with miners and their families, the mountain alive with industry and human voices. Elena remembered treating the miners' animals back then, when she'd first arrived in Romania as a newly turned vampire, desperate to cling to her former profession. The irony of a predator healing prey hadn't been lost on her even then. When the mines closed in the 1960s, the humans had left, but Elena remained. The empty buildings provided perfect camouflage for her activities, and the isolation kept her safe from the vampire courts that might question her unusual dietary choices. Most vampires fed on humans directly. Elena had trained herself to subsist on animal blood and the occasional willing donor from distant villages who believed her to be merely an eccentric doctor. She dozed fitfully as day broke over the mountains, her supernatural senses still monitoring the creatures in her care. The smaller wolves were recovering well, their heartbeats had strengthened, and she could hear them moving restlessly in their enclosures. But the large male remained still, his breathing deep and even in what appeared to be natural sleep. When evening came, Elena rose with the familiar weight of solitude settling over her shoulders. 300 years of nights stretching ahead, each one identical to the last. The thought had never bothered her before. Immortality required a certain acceptance of repetition. But as she prepared to check on her patients, she found herself hesitating at the threshold of her chambers. Something had shifted the night before. Some carefully maintained balance in her world had tilted, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her sanctuary was no longer quite so separate from the outside world. The sanctuary's main chamber was warm and humid, filled with the sounds of recovering animals. Elena moved through her evening routine with mechanical precision, but her attention kept wandering to the large examination table where the male wolf lay. He was awake, she realized, his golden eyes tracking her movements as she tended to the others. "Good evening," she found herself saying to him, then immediately felt foolish for addressing a wolf as though he were a dinner guest. His tail moved slightly, not quite a wag, but an acknowledgement that made her pause mid-step. Elena had spoken to the animals in her care for decades, finding comfort in one-sided conversations that helped fill the endless silence. But she'd never felt as though any of them were truly listening before. This wolf, however, seemed to hang on her every word with an attention that bordered on unnerving. "You're feeling stronger," she observed, noting the alertness in his posture. "My blood works quickly on your species." The wolf's head tilted slightly, and Elena could have sworn she saw something flicker behind those impossible eyes. Surprise? Understanding? She shook her head, dismissing the thought as wishful thinking born of too many years alone. But as she turned to prepare the evening feeding for her other patients, she caught sight of her reflection in the darkened window. For the first time in decades, she looked truly alive, energized by puzzle and purpose in ways that simple animal care had never provided. Outside, the wind howled its familiar song through the abandoned mining equipment, but tonight it sounded different. Not like the voice of isolation, but like a warning of changes yet to come. The warning in the wind proved prophetic. Elena had just finished distributing the evening meal, mostly raw meat from her carefully maintained stores, though the smallest wolves still required supplemental feedings of her blood, when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to her sanctuary, the distant rumble of engines echoing through the mountain passes. She froze, a bowl of water halfway to one of the recovery enclosures. In the 15 years since the last mining equipment had been removed from Ravasitul, no vehicles had ventured up these treacherous roads. The path to her sanctuary was deliberately difficult to find, hidden behind rockfalls she'd carefully arranged and overgrown with vegetation that discouraged casual exploration. The large male wolf had gone rigid on his examination table, ears pricked forward with an alertness that bordered on alarming. His golden eyes fixed on the tunnel entrance as though he could see through solid rock to whatever approached. Elena set down the water bowl with hands that trembled slightly. "It's probably nothing," she whispered, though whether to comfort herself or the wolf she wasn't certain. "Lost travelers, perhaps. They'll turn back when the road becomes impassable." But the engines grew louder, accompanied now by the crunch of tires on snow and ice. Multiple vehicles, moving with purpose rather than uncertainty. Elena's supernatural hearing picked up fragments of conversation carried on the wind, Romanian voices speaking in the clipped, efficient tones of people conducting official business. The smaller wolves began to whine, sensing her distress. Elena moved among them with practiced calm, but her mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Government officials investigating reports of unusual activity, hunters tracking the wolf pack she'd rescued, or worse, other vampires who'd somehow discovered her location. She'd spent 3 centuries avoiding exactly this scenario. Her sanctuary existed because it was secret, because she'd made herself invisible to both human and supernatural authorities. If that invisibility was compromised, the sound of car doors slamming echoed through the mountain passes, followed by human footsteps crunching through snow. Elena counted at least 3 distinct gates, possibly more. Her enhanced vision picked up the glow of flashlights, moving through the abandoned buildings above, methodical and searching. "Dr. Varga!" a woman's voice called out, the words bouncing off the empty structures. "We know you're here. We need to speak with you." Elena's blood went cold. They knew her name, knew she was here. The careful anonymity she'd maintained was shattered with those few words. The large male wolf made a sound deep in his throat, not quite a growl, but something that raised every hair on Elena's neck. When she looked at him, his eyes held an expression she'd never seen in an animal before, protective fury. "Dr. Varga, we're not here to harm you." A different voice this time, male and younger. "We represent certain interested parties who've become aware of your work, your unique methods of wildlife rehabilitation." Wildlife rehabilitation. The euphemism made Elena's hands clench into fists. They knew about the blood feedings. Somehow, someone had discovered her secret and reported it to whatever organization these people represented. Her mind catalogued escape routes, the deeper tunnels that led to emergency exits carved into the mountainside, paths only she knew about. She could run, abandon everything she'd built here, start over somewhere else as she'd done before. It would mean leaving her patients behind, but it would ensure her survival. The large male wolf struggled to lift himself on the examination table, his recovery remarkably advanced for such a short time. His golden eyes met hers with unmistakable intent. He was preparing to defend her, despite his weakened state. "No," Elena whispered, placing a gentle hand on his massive head. "You're not strong enough yet." But even as she spoke, she realized the truth of her situation. For the first time in decades, she had something worth protecting beyond her own safety. These 15 wolves, and particularly this mysterious male who watched her with such unsettling intelligence, had become more than just patients. They'd become her responsibility in a way that transcended simple veterinary care. "Dr. Varga, we're coming down." The woman's voice was closer now, just above the main tunnel entrance. "Please don't make this more difficult than necessary." Elena stood at the crossroads of her carefully constructed existence. She could flee into the mountains, preserving the isolation that had kept her safe for so long. Or she could stand her ground and face whatever these strangers wanted, protecting the sanctuary she'd built and the creatures who depended on her care. The choice crystallized as she looked around the chamber, at the recovering wolves who'd begun to trust her, at the larger male whose golden eyes held secrets she was only beginning to glimpse, at the life she'd built in defiance of her monstrous nature. Footsteps echoed in the tunnel entrance, growing closer. Elena straightened her shoulders and moved to stand between the intruders and her patients, her decision made. For 3 centuries, she'd chosen safety over purpose, isolation over connection. Tonight, that changed. The footsteps in the tunnel grew closer, and Elena's resolve wavered like candle flame in a draught. What had seemed like courage moments before now felt like the height of foolishness. 3 centuries of survival instincts screamed at her to run, to abandon this place and these creatures before it was too late. Her hands trembled as she stood between the tunnel entrance and her patients. Behind her, she could hear the smaller wolves shifting restlessly, picking up on her fear despite her attempts to project calm. The large male remained motionless on the examination table, but his golden eyes never left her face, as though he could see straight through to her terror. "What am I doing?" The question echoed in her mind like an accusation. She was a healer, not a warrior, a creature who had spent centuries avoiding confrontation, not seeking it. The smart thing, the sensible thing, would be to slip away through the emergency tunnels to preserve herself for future good works, rather than throwing everything away on a moment's misguided nobility. "Dr. Varga?" The woman's voice was closer now, perhaps 50 feet down the main tunnel. "We know this is frightening, but we truly do mean you no harm." Elena's enhanced hearing caught the subtle sounds beneath the reassuring words, the whisper of fabric against weapons, the careful placement of feet that spoke of tactical training. These weren't wildlife officials or concerned citizens. They moved like predators, like hunters who'd found their quarry. The realization sent ice through her veins. If they knew what she was, if they'd come specifically for her. She thought of the old stories, whispered among vampire kind about government organizations that captured and studied their kind. She'd dismissed them as paranoid fantasies, but standing here in her sanctuary with armed strangers approaching, those stories took on a terrifying new plausibility. A soft whine from one of the smaller wolves made her turn. The young female she'd found half frozen was looking at her with dark, trusting eyes, the same expression Elena had seen on countless animals over the centuries, the look that said, "You saved us, you'll protect us." But how could she protect anyone when she could barely control her own fear? The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. 15 lives depending on her care, and she was ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. What kind of protector was she? What kind of healer abandoned her patients when they needed her most? But the alternative was equally terrifying. If these people truly knew what she was, staying meant exposure. It meant the end of everything she'd built, everything she'd become. Worse, it might mean becoming the very monster she'd spent 3 centuries trying not to be. What would happen if they threatened her patients? Would her careful control shatter? Would the predator she'd kept caged for so long finally break free? Elena closed her eyes, memories flooding back unbidden. The taste of human blood, hot and rich and infinitely more satisfying than the animal blood she'd trained herself to accept. The rush of power that came with feeding directly from the source. The way her victims had looked at her in those final moments, not with the trust she saw in animal eyes, but with terror and betrayal. She'd sworn never to be that creature again, never to let the monster win. But if these strangers pushed her, if they threatened the innocent lives in her care— "I can hear your heartbeat, Doctor." The male voice was much closer now, intimate in the tunnel's confines. "You're afraid. You don't need to be." The casual mention of her heartbeat made Elena's blood freeze. Humans couldn't hear vampire heartbeats from that distance. The sound was too faint, too irregular, which meant either they had supernatural hearing themselves, or they carried equipment specifically designed to detect vampiric physiology. The large male wolf made a sound deep in his throat, barely audible but somehow conveying volumes. When Elena looked at him, his expression had changed. Where before she'd seen protective fury, now there was something that looked disturbingly like understanding, as though he knew exactly what she was facing, what she feared, what was at stake. For one wild moment, she wanted to confide in him, to pour out her terror and uncertainty to those impossibly intelligent eyes, to seek guidance from a creature who seemed to see her more clearly than she saw herself. The impulse was so strong it left her breathless and deeply disturbed. Since when did she turn to wild animals for emotional support? Light flickered at the tunnel's mouth, flashlights probing the darkness, growing steadily brighter. Elena had perhaps a minute before they reached the sanctuary chamber, before her careful isolation ended forever. A minute to decide between the cowardice that had kept her alive for 3 centuries and the courage that might destroy everything she'd worked to become. The wolves watched her with absolute trust, and Elena felt that trust like a weight around her heart. They believed in her. They'd placed their lives in her hands, just as she'd once placed countless human lives in her care back when the world made sense. But this wasn't her human life. This was something far more complicated, far more dangerous. And she was no longer the confident young veterinarian who'd once believed healing was always possible. The footsteps echoed louder now, accompanied by the systematic sweep of flashlight beams. Elena stood frozen between flight and fight, paralyzed by the magnitude of a choice she was rapidly running out of time to make. The beam of the first flashlight swept into the sanctuary chamber, and Elena's paralysis shattered like glass. "Stay back!" she called out, stepping fully into the light. Her voice carried a strength she didn't feel, echoing off the stone walls with an authority that surprised even her. These animals are still recovering. Sudden movements or loud noises could set back their healing. 3 figures emerged from the tunnel, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in practical winter gear that couldn't quite conceal the tactical equipment beneath. Elena's enhanced vision caught the telltale bulges of weapons, the subtle earpieces, the way they moved to establish a perimeter around her sanctuary. Professional, military. "Dr. Elena Varga," the woman said, lowering her flashlight but keeping it ready. She was perhaps 40, with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing. "My name is Colonel Petra Ionescu. We represent a joint task force investigating unusual wildlife incidents in the Carpathian region." Elena forced herself to remain still, even as every instinct screamed at her to run. Behind her, she could hear the wolves stirring, not in panic, but in response to her own tension. The large male had managed to lift himself to a sitting position on the examination table, his golden eyes fixed on the intruders with predatory focus. "I'm not aware of any incidents," Elena said carefully. "I maintain proper documentation for all my rehabilitation work." Colonel Ionescu's smile was thin. "Dr. Varga, we've been monitoring unusual electromagnetic readings from this location for several months, readings that intensified significantly 3 nights ago, coinciding with reports of an entire wolf pack disappearing from the lower valleys during the blizzard." The words hit Elena like physical blows. They'd been watching. For months, everything she'd done, every life she'd saved, had been catalogued and analyzed by strangers who spoke in euphemisms about electromagnetic readings when they meant supernatural activity. "Wolves seek shelter during storms," Elena said, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's natural behavior. Not 15 wolves appearing simultaneously in an abandoned mine system," the younger man interjected. His accent was American, and when he stepped closer, Elena caught scents that made her supernatural senses recoil: silver, cold iron, and something else. Something that smelled of old blood and older power. They knew, perhaps not the specifics, but they knew she wasn't human. The careful life she'd built, the isolation that had protected her for decades, all of it was crumbling around her with each word they spoke. Elena's gaze darted to the emergency tunnels she'd mapped so carefully, calculating distances and escape routes. She could be gone in seconds, vanished into passages these humans would never find. Start over somewhere new, somewhere safer. But as she prepared to bolt, a sound stopped her cold. The large male wolf had risen fully from the examination table, his massive frame moving with fluid grace despite his recent ordeal. He positioned himself directly between Elena and the intruders, his lips pulling back to reveal teeth that gleamed in the flashlight beams. The growl that emerged from his throat was unlike anything Elena had ever heard, deep, resonant, and carrying an authority that made the humans instinctively step backward. "Remarkable," Colonel Ionescu breathed. "The loyalty is extraordinary. Almost as though—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Elena heard the implication. Almost as though there was more than simple animal instinct at work. Almost as though the wolf understood exactly what was happening and had chosen his side. The other wolves were rising now, moving from their various resting places to form a loose circle around Elena. Not aggressive, but unmistakably protective. 15 pairs of eyes reflecting the flashlight beams, 15 bodies ready to defend the woman who had saved them. Elena looked around at the creatures she'd rescued, at the sanctuary she'd de-built, at the life she'd carved from centuries of isolation and guilt. These wolves trusted her absolutely. They'd placed their faith in her hands, and now they were prepared to fight for her. The realization hit her with stunning clarity. She couldn't run, not because she lacked the ability or opportunity, but because running would betray everything she'd tried to become. For 3 centuries she'd hidden from her nature, from other vampires, from any situation that might force her to choose between safety and principle. But healing meant more than just mending bodies. It meant taking responsibility for the lives entrusted to her care. It meant standing firm when those lives were threatened, regardless of the personal cost. "What do you want?" Elena asked, her voice steady now, anchored by purpose rather than fear. Colonel Ionescu's expression shifted, recognizing the change. To talk, Dr. Varga, about your work, about certain capabilities you possess that might be of interest to national security. Elena felt the last of her uncertainty drain away, replaced by something she hadn't experienced in decades, the absolute clarity of commitment. She was done running, done hiding. Whatever came next, she would face it here, in the sanctuary she'd built, surrounded by creatures who had chosen to trust her. The threshold had been crossed. There was no going back. Elena held Colonel Ionescu's gaze, feeling the weight of 15 pairs of wolf eyes watching the exchange. The large male remained positioned between her and the intruders, his massive frame radiating protective tension that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. National security, Elena repeated slowly. What exactly does that mean in the context of wildlife rehabilitation? The American operative shifted, his hand moving unconsciously toward something concealed beneath his jacket. Dr. Varga, we have satellite footage of you carrying multiple full-grown wolves through a blizzard, alone, in conditions that killed 3 experienced mountaineers just 50 kilometers south. Elena's enhanced hearing caught the subtle emphasis on alone. They knew a human woman shouldn't have possessed such strength, but how much did they actually understand about what she was? Knowledge, in this case, might determine whether this ended in negotiation or bloodshed. I'm stronger than I look, she said carefully. Colonel Ionescu stepped closer, her movements deliberate and unthreatening, but Elena noticed how the woman's companions adjusted their positions to maintain tactical advantage. These weren't researchers or wildlife officials. They were hunters, and she was beginning to understand she might be the prey. Doctor, we represent a NATO initiative called the Carpathian Anomalies Research Division. We investigate phenomena that fall outside conventional scientific explanation. The colonel's voice carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering classified briefings. Recent events in this region have attracted significant attention from our organization. What kind of events? Elena asked, though she dreaded the answer. Livestock drained of blood with surgical precision, witnesses reporting figures moving at impossible speeds through the forests, and electromagnetic disturbances that suggest the presence of entities with unusual bioelectric signatures. Elena's blood went cold. They weren't just investigating her sanctuary. They were tracking vampire activity throughout the region. The careful isolation she'd maintained wasn't just threatened, it was already compromised by the actions of others of her kind. The large male wolf moved slightly, positioning himself to better shield Elena from the operatives. His golden eyes never left Colonel Ionescu's face, and Elena caught something in his expression that made her breath catch. He was listening to every word with an intelligence that transcended animal comprehension. I rescue injured wildlife, Elena said, forcing calm into her voice. Nothing more. Using feeding techniques that have resulted in remarkable recovery rates, the younger operative interjected. Recovery rates that border on miraculous, according to our analysis. They'd been watching longer than months, Elena realized. They'd documented her methods, analyzed her results, built a profile that painted her as something extraordinary, something worth investigating by a NATO task force dedicated to supernatural phenomena. Wounded animals respond well to proper care, she said, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Colonel Ionescu's expression softened slightly, taking on what might have been sympathy. Dr. Varga, we're not here as your enemies. The entities we typically deal with are less benevolent in their intentions. Your work suggests you're something different, something that might be willing to cooperate. The word cooperate hung in the air like a threat wrapped in diplomatic language. Elena understood the implication. Work with them voluntarily or be classified as a potential threat requiring more aggressive handling. Behind the colonel, movement in the shadows caught Elena's attention. More figures emerging from the tunnels, spreading out to surround the sanctuary chamber. They'd brought backup, positioned strategically while she'd been focused on the primary team, professional, thorough, and utterly prepared for resistance. What kind of cooperation? Elena asked, buying time while her mind raced through increasingly limited options. Information sharing. Consultation on cases involving unusual predatory behavior, perhaps assistance with containment protocols when necessary. Colonel Ionescu's tone remained conversational, but Elena heard the steel beneath the diplomacy. In exchange, you'd be free to continue your work here under our protection. Protection. The euphemism made Elena's hands clench, protection that came with oversight, supervision, and the constant threat of withdrawal if she proved uncooperative. They were offering her a cage disguised as sanctuary. The large male wolf made a sound deep in his throat, not quite a growl, but something that carried unmistakable warning. Around the chamber, the other wolves shifted restlessly, picking up on the tension that crackled between human and vampire like electricity before a storm. "And if I decline?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Colonel Ionescu's expression hardened. "Then you become classified as a potential threat to civilian populations, and we have protocols for handling potential threats." The words confirmed Elena's worst fears about government vampire hunters, but also crystallized something else, a fierce protective anger she hadn't felt in decades. These people had invaded her sanctuary, threatened her patience, and were now attempting to coerce her into betraying everything she'd worked to become. For the first time since Colonel Ionescu had spoken her name, Elena smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Colonel," she said quietly, "I think you may have underestimated what you're dealing with here." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees as Elena's words settled into the stone-carved silence. Colonel Ionescu's hand moved imperceptibly toward her sidearm while her operatives shifted into more aggressive stances. Elena could hear their heartbeats accelerating, could smell the sharp tang of adrenaline mixing with the metallic scent of their weapons. "Dr. Varga," the colonel said carefully, "I hope you're not considering anything inadvisable." Elena's smile widened, revealing teeth that had grown noticeably sharper in the past few seconds. "I'm considering exactly what any veterinarian would consider when strangers threaten her patients." The large male wolf rose to his full height, and Elena realized with a start that he was even more massive than she'd initially assessed. Standing, his shoulder reached nearly to her waist, and his golden eyes held an intelligence that made her skin prickle with recognition she couldn't quite place. When he stepped forward, the operatives actually retreated, trained soldiers backing away from what should have been a recovering wild animal. "Remarkable," Colonel Ionescu breathed, though whether she referred to the wolf's size or his obvious protectiveness wasn't clear. "The bond between you is extraordinary. How long have you known each other?" The question caught Elena off guard. "I found him 3 days ago, like the others." "No." The colonel's voice carried absolute certainty. "The way he responds to you, the way he positions himself, that's not gratitude, Doctor. That's loyalty built over time. Significant time." Elena looked down at the massive wolf beside her, seeing him truly for the first time. The scars that marked his dark fur weren't random. They formed patterns that spoke of battles, of violence on a scale that went far beyond normal animal conflicts. His bearing wasn't that of a wild creature grateful for rescue. It was regal, commanding, ancient. And those eyes, those impossible golden eyes that seemed to hold centuries of knowledge, centuries of power. "What are you?" Elena whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The wolf turned to meet her gaze, and in that moment, something passed between them, a recognition that went deeper than species, deeper than the careful boundaries Elena had maintained for 3 centuries. She felt it like electricity along her nerves, a connection that defied everything she understood about her own nature. "Fascinating," the American operative murmured, raising what Elena now recognized as some kind of electromagnetic scanning device. "The energy readings between them are off the charts. Whatever this is, it's not natural." Elena's protective instincts flared. "Put that down, now." Her voice carried a compulsion she hadn't used in decades, backed by the full force of her vampiric nature. The operative's hand began to lower involuntarily before he caught himself, his eyes widening with shock and fear. "Confirmed vampire," he reported into his earpiece, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Class unknown, but demonstrating mental influence capabilities." The words shattered any pretense of diplomacy. Elena felt her carefully constructed facade crumbling, revealing the predator she'd kept hidden for so long. Around the chamber, her rescued wolves moved into defensive positions, responding to her emotional state with coordinated precision that spoke of pack intelligence. Colonel Ionescu drew her weapon, not a conventional firearm, but something that hummed with electric potential and smelled of silver and sanctified metal. "Dr. Varga, you need to stand down. We don't want to hurt you, but we have our orders." "Your orders," Elena said, her voice carrying deadly calm, "involve threatening creatures under my protection. That's not something I can allow." The large male wolf moved then, flowing like liquid shadow to position himself directly in front of Elena. His growl filled the chamber with harmonics that seemed to resonate in the stone itself, and Elena felt something impossible, power, ancient and vast, radiating from his massive frame. This wasn't just a wolf. This was something else entirely, something that had chosen to stand with her against trained supernatural hunters, something that felt familiar in ways that made her long-dormant vampiric instincts sing with recognition. "Colonel," Elena said, her enhanced senses tracking the positions of every operative in the chamber, mapping exit strategies and threat assessments with predatory precision. "I think it's time for you to leave my sanctuary." "We can't do that, Doctor. You're coming with us, along with your companion. Our scientists need to understand what's happening here." Elena felt the last restraints on her true nature snap like overwound wire. For 3 centuries, she'd suppressed the vampire within, had chosen healing over hunting, isolation over dominion. But these strangers had invaded her sanctuary, threatened her patience, and were now attempting to drag her back into a world of laboratories and containment protocols. She took a step forward, and the operatives raised their weapons. The large male wolf mirrored her movement, his massive body coiled with lethal potential. Around them, 14 other wolves formed a protective circle, their eyes reflecting the tactical lights like stars in the darkness. "Colonel Ionescu," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 3 centuries of controlled power finally unleashed. "You have 30 seconds to leave my territory before I show you exactly what you're dealing with." The true confrontation was about to begin. The 30 seconds stretched like an eternity. Elena felt the familiar surge of vampiric power flooding her veins, strength that could crush stone, speed that could outpace bullets, senses that mapped every heartbeat and breath in the chamber with predatory precision. For 3 centuries, she'd kept this force leashed, controlled, directed only toward healing. Now, as Colonel Ionescu's weapon remained trained on her chest, Elena finally understood what she'd been hiding from. Not discovery, not capture, not even death. She'd been hiding from the choice between her nature and her conscience. 20 seconds, Elena said softly. The large male wolf pressed closer to her side, and she felt something impossible radiating from his massive frame, power that dwarfed even her own, ancient and terrible and utterly controlled. His golden eyes never left the operatives, but Elena sensed his attention focused on her, waiting for some signal she didn't understand. Colonel Ionescu's finger tightened on her weapon's trigger. "Doctor, you're making a mistake. We have backup teams positioned throughout these tunnels. You can't fight your way out." "I'm not planning to fight my way out," Elena replied, and the honesty of it surprised her. She looked around the sanctuary chamber, at the wolves who trusted her with their lives, at the medical equipment that had helped her save dozens of creatures over the years, at the careful haven she'd built from centuries of guilt and isolation. "I'm planning to defend my home." The words transformed something fundamental inside her. For 300 years she'd thought of herself as a refugee, hiding from her own kind, a monster trying to atone for centuries of darkness she could barely remember. But standing here, surrounded by creatures who'd chosen to trust her, Elena finally understood what she'd actually become. A protector, a healer, someone worth defending. The American operative's scanning device emitted a high-pitched whine. Energy levels are spiking. Both subjects are... His words cut off as Elena moved. Vampiric speed rendered the world into slow motion. She saw the operative's finger squeeze his trigger, saw the silver-charged projectile begin its trajectory toward her chest, saw Colonel Ionescu's eyes widen as Elena simply wasn't where the bullet expected her to be. But speed alone wouldn't solve this. There were too many operatives, too many weapons designed specifically for creatures like her. Raw power would only confirm their worst assumptions about vampire threats to humanity. Instead, Elena did something she'd never attempted before. She reached out with her enhanced senses, mapping the electromagnetic signatures of every piece of equipment in the chamber, feeling for the delicate electronics that powered their weapons and communications. The pulse of mental energy that erupted from her was unlike anything she'd ever generated. Not the crude compulsion she'd used moments before, but something far more sophisticated. Elena felt the vampire power she'd suppressed for centuries, flowing through pathways she'd forgotten existed, seeking and finding the vulnerable circuits that kept her enemies armed. Every piece of electronic equipment in the chamber died simultaneously. Emergency lights failed, weapons powered down, communication devices went silent. Even the operatives' night vision goggles flickered and went dark, leaving them blind in the absolute darkness of the underground sanctuary. But Elena could see perfectly. Her vampiric vision turned the pitch-black chamber into a landscape of heat signatures and movement. She watched the trained soldiers struggle to adapt, reaching for backup equipment that had also been fried by her electromagnetic pulse. "Impossible," Colonel Ionescu whispered in the darkness. "The range, the precision..." "You wanted to know what you were dealing with," Elena said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber. "I'm Dr. Elena Varga. I've been a veterinarian for over 3 centuries. I've saved thousands of lives, and I've never harmed a human being in all that time." She moved through the darkness, positioning herself where the colonel's voice had originated. "But if you threaten my patients again, I will show you exactly how much restraint I've been exercising." A low growl filled the chamber, and Elena realized it wasn't coming from the large male wolf. It was coming from her own throat, carrying harmonics that made the human's weapons rattle in their nerveless hands. "The exit tunnel is behind you," Elena continued, her voice deadly calm. "I suggest you use it, now." For a moment, the only sound was the rapid breathing of frightened humans and the soft padding of wolf paws on stone. Then Colonel Ionescu's voice cut through the darkness, tight with barely controlled fear. "This isn't over, Doctor. My superiors need to know about the threat level you represent." "Tell them," Elena said quietly, "that I represent exactly the threat they choose to create." Footsteps echoed through the chamber as the operatives retreated toward the tunnels. Elena tracked their progress with predatory precision until the last heat signature disappeared into the mountain's depths. Only then did she allow herself to collapse against the stone wall, her legs suddenly weak with the aftermath of unleashed power. The large male wolf approached slowly, his massive head pressing against her trembling hands. In his golden eyes she saw something that made her breath catch, approval, recognition, and something else. Something that felt like kinship. "What are we?" Elena whispered into the darkness. His answering growl carried notes she'd never heard before, ancient, regal, and filled with secrets that might destroy everything she thought she knew about the supernatural world. The sanctuary was safe for now, but Elena understood with crystal clarity that her 3 centuries of hiding were over. The real ordeal was just beginning. The silence that followed the operatives' retreat felt more ominous than their threats had. Elena remained pressed against the cold stone wall, her enhanced hearing tracking the humans' progress through the mountain tunnels until their footsteps faded completely into the winter wind above. Only then did the magnitude of what she'd just done begin to settle into her bones like ice. 3 centuries of careful anonymity, destroyed in 30 seconds. "They'll be back," Elena whispered to the darkness, her voice barely audible even to her own enhanced senses. "And they won't come unprepared next time." The large male wolf pressed closer, his massive head nudging her trembling hands with surprising gentleness. But even his warmth couldn't chase away the cold certainty spreading through Elena's chest. She'd revealed herself to a NATO supernatural task force, demonstrated powers she'd forgotten she possessed, and made enemies of people who had resources she couldn't begin to imagine. Worse, she'd enjoyed it. For those brief moments when vampiric power had flooded her veins, when her true nature had finally been unleashed after centuries of suppression, Elena had felt more alive than she had in decades. The realization made her sick with self-loathing. Around the chamber, her rescued wolves moved restlessly, picking up on her emotional turmoil. They looked to her for guidance, for the steady confidence that had made her their anchor in this sanctuary beneath the mountains. Instead, they found a creature whose hands shook as she tried to assess the disaster she'd created. Elena forced herself to stand, to project calm she didn't feel. "We need to leave," she announced to the darkness. "Tonight." The words tasted like ashes. This sanctuary had been her home for nearly 2 decades, the first place since her transformation where she'd felt truly purposeful. She'd built everything here: the medical facilities, the carefully maintained ecosystem, the fragile peace she'd constructed between her vampiric nature and her human conscience. Now it was all compromised. Elena began moving through the chamber with mechanical precision, gathering the most essential medical supplies. Her hands worked automatically, while her mind spiraled through increasingly desperate scenarios. Where could she take 15 recovering wolves? How could she protect them when she couldn't even protect herself? The nearest safe territory was hundreds of kilometers away, across borders guarded by the same governments that had just marked her as a supernatural threat. Dr. Varga. The voice froze Elena's blood, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it wasn't. She knew that voice, though she'd never heard it before. Deep, commanding, carrying an authority that seemed to resonate in her very bones. She turned slowly, her enhanced vision searching the shadows. The chamber appeared empty except for her wolves, but the voice had been unmistakably real, unmistakably close. "You're not losing your mind," the voice continued, and Elena's gaze snapped to the large male wolf. He stood perfectly still, golden eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Though I imagine this is rather shocking." Elena's medical supplies scattered across the stone floor. That's impossible. More impossible than a 300-year-old veterinarian with electromagnetic pulse capabilities?" There was dry humor in the mental voice, along with something that sounded almost like fondness. "I think we've moved well beyond the realm of normal possibilities, Elena." The casual use of her name sent tremors through Elena's composure. She sank to her knees, bringing herself to eye level with the massive wolf. Up close, those golden eyes held depths that spoke of centuries, of power, of experiences that dwarfed even her own long existence. "What are you?" she breathed. "Someone who's been searching for you for a very long time." The wolf's physical form remained perfectly still, but his mental voice carried weight that made the air itself seem heavy. "Someone who watched you risk everything tonight to protect creatures you'd known for mere days. Someone who finally understands why the legends spoke of you with such reverence." "Legends?" Elena's voice cracked. "I'm nobody. I'm just a veterinarian who feeds her own blood to dying animals. Who built a sanctuary in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Who just faced down a military task force to protect 15 wolves she barely knew." The mental voice gentled. "Elena, you're anything but nobody." The kindness in those words broke something fundamental inside her. For 3 centuries, Elena had carried the weight of her vampiric nature like a curse, had fought daily battles against instincts she considered monstrous. She'd hidden, isolated herself, convinced that her very existence was a threat to everything good in the world. But this creature, whatever he was, spoke as if her struggles meant something, as if the choices she'd made, the sacrifices she'd endured, had value beyond mere survival. "It doesn't matter now," Elena said, tears she hadn't shed in decades burning behind her eyes. They know what I am. They'll hunt me, and anyone near me will be in danger. I won't let you get hurt because of me. Oh, Elena. The wolf moved closer, his massive head pressing against her shoulder with infinite gentleness. You still don't understand, do you? You're not the one in danger here. They'll be back with specialized weapons, vampire hunters, government resources. Let them come. The simple words carried such absolute confidence that Elena's breath caught. For the first time since the operatives had spoken her name, she felt something besides despair stirring in her chest. Hope, dangerous, impossible, but undeniably real. Elena stared into those ancient golden eyes, her rational mind struggling to process the impossible conversation she was having with a wolf. The hope flickering in her chest warred with 3 centuries of learned caution, of hiding from truths too dangerous to confront. You speak as if you have power over trained supernatural operatives, she said carefully, as if government task forces are nothing more than minor inconveniences. The wolf's mental voice carried amusement that felt older than mountains. Elena, what do you know about vampire hierarchy? The question hit her like a physical blow. Elena's hands clenched in the wolf's thick fur as memories she'd spent centuries suppressing crashed through her carefully constructed mental barriers. Images of marble halls and crimson banners, of creatures who moved through shadow and commanded obedience with a glance, of a court she'd fled in terror when she'd first understood what she'd become. I know enough to stay away from it, she whispered. I know that vampires who involve themselves with power structures tend to lose whatever humanity they have left. And yet you've retained more humanity than any vampire I've encountered in a millennium. The casual reference to 1,000 years of existence made Elena's enhanced senses real. She found herself studying the wolf's massive frame with new understanding, noting the way the other wolves deferred to him, the ancient authority that seemed to radiate from his very presence. You're not just any supernatural creature, Elena said slowly. You're something specific, something important. I am what your kind would call the Vampire King. The revelation hit Elena like an avalanche. She jerked backward, her medical training screaming warnings about proximity to apex predators, her vampiric instincts recognizing dominance that could crush her without effort. But the wolf, the king, made no move to follow, simply watched her with patient golden eyes. That's impossible, Elena breathed. The Vampire King is a legend, a story told to keep young vampires in line. I assure you I'm quite real. My name is Dmitri Kozlov, and I've been searching for the legendary healer of the Carpathians for the better part of 2 decades. His mental voice carried gentle humor. Imagine my surprise when she saved my life without realizing who I was. Elena's world tilted. Every assumption she'd built about herself, about her place in the supernatural hierarchy, crumbled like ancient parchment. The Vampire King, if he truly was who he claimed, commanded the loyalty of vampires across continents. His word was law to creatures who considered themselves above human authority, and she'd been feeding him deer blood and checking his temperature like any ordinary patient. The curse, Elena said suddenly, pieces of an impossible puzzle clicking into place. You're trapped in wolf form. That's why you're here, why you couldn't simply reveal yourself. A witch's revenge, Dmitri confirmed. I've been searching for a healer powerful enough to understand the binding, someone whose connection to life itself might offer insights into breaking it. Your reputation preceded you, Elena. Stories of the vampire who chose healing over hunting, who fed her own life force to dying creatures, who built sanctuaries instead of territories. The weight of his words settled over Elena like a shroud. She'd spent 3 centuries believing herself insignificant, a footnote in vampire history trying to atone for a nature she couldn't change. But if Dmitri spoke truth, if her choices had somehow created a legend that reached even the Vampire King himself, you came to the Carpathians looking for me specifically, she said, the revelation reshaping everything she thought she understood about their meeting. I came seeking a healer. I found something far more precious. Dimitri's mental voice carried warmth that made Elena's long-dormant heart ache. I found someone who risks everything for creatures she's known for days, someone who faces down military task forces to protect the vulnerable, someone who embodies everything noble about what we could choose to become. Elena felt tears tracking down her cheeks, tears she'd thought herself incapable of shedding. For centuries she'd carried shame like armor, convinced that her vampiric nature made her inherently monstrous regardless of her actions. But Dimitri spoke as if her choices mattered, as if the daily battle between nature and conscience had transformed her into something worthy of respect. "The operatives," Elena whispered, understanding flooding through her. "When you said let them come, you weren't just being brave. You have actual power to stop them. The supernatural task forces operate under treaties signed with vampire courts decades ago. They have jurisdiction over rogue supernatural entities, but not over vampires operating under royal protection." Dimitri's golden eyes gleamed with something that might have been satisfaction. "Colonel Ionescu will discover that her quarry has become significantly more complicated." Elena stared at the massive wolf, who claimed to be the most powerful vampire in existence, the creature she'd saved without thought for reward or recognition. The hope in her chest blazed brighter, transforming into something that felt dangerously like possibility. Everything had shifted. Her careful isolation was over, but perhaps that wasn't the catastrophe she'd believed it to be. Perhaps it was liberation. Elena rose slowly from her knees, her legs surprisingly steady despite the earth-shattering revelations of the past hour. The terror that had consumed her since the operatives' retreat was transforming into something else entirely, not the reckless hope of desperation, but the calculated confidence of someone who finally understood the game board. "Royal protection," she repeated, testing the words. They felt foreign on her tongue, concepts she'd never imagined applying to herself. "You're saying that your authority supersedes human government jurisdiction over supernatural entities?" The treaties were signed in 1847, after the London incident made it clear that open warfare between human and vampire forces would devastate both sides. Dimitri's mental voice carried the weight of historical knowledge. Human governments gained the right to police rogue supernatural activities in exchange for recognizing vampire sovereignty over our own kind. Elena began pacing the chamber, her enhanced mind processing implications at vampiric speed. "But I've been operating outside vampire society for 3 centuries. I'm not part of any court structure, any formal hierarchy. You are now." The simple declaration stopped Elena mid-stride. She turned to face the massive wolf, seeing him with new understanding. Not just a patient she'd saved, not even just an ancient creature trapped by dark magic. This was the Vampire King, and he was offering her something she'd never dared to imagine: legitimacy. "The other wolves," Elena said suddenly, her gaze sweeping across her patients. "They sense what you are, don't they? That's why they've been so calm, so organized. You've been leading them even in this form." A ripple of amusement colored Dimitri's mental response. Pack dynamics translate surprisingly well across species, though I must say your feeding schedule has been far more regular than anything I implemented during my human ruling days. Despite everything, Elena found herself smiling. The absurdity of the Vampire King commenting on her veterinary care routines struck her as profoundly ridiculous and oddly touching. "You're going to make jokes at a time like this?" "Elena, I've been trapped in wolf form for 3 years, sustained on deer blood and medical attention from the most legendary vampire healer of the last 4 centuries. If I can't find humor in the situation, I might lose what remains of my sanity." The casual reference to her reputation still made Elena's enhanced senses real. She moved to her medical supplies, no longer gathering them for a desperate escape, but organizing them with renewed purpose. "Tell me about this curse. If I'm truly the healer you've been seeking, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Morgana Blackthorn. Even in mental communication, the name carried venom, a witch whose coven I was forced to discipline when their blood rituals began targeting vampire territories. Her revenge was elegant, I'll grant her that much. She bound my consciousness to wolf form while leaving my vampiric nature intact but inaccessible. Elena paused in her inventory, pieces clicking together. That's why you can communicate telepathically but can't transform back. The curse creates a barrier between your wolf consciousness and your vampire powers. Precisely. I retain all my memories, my knowledge, my mental capabilities, but I cannot access the physical transformation that would return me to humanoid form. Worse, the longer I remain trapped, the more the wolf instincts integrate with my consciousness. The implications made Elena's blood run cold. You're losing yourself to the animal nature, gradually, which is why finding you became more than just political necessity. Dimitri's golden eyes met hers with startling vulnerability. You don't simply heal bodies, Elena. You heal the connections between different aspects of supernatural nature. Your work with dying animals, feeding them your own life force, you're bridging the gap between vampire and living essence. Elena set down her medical kit, her hands trembling slightly. You think I can break the curse because I've learned to balance vampiric nature with healing instincts? I think you understand better than anyone how to maintain humanity while embracing supernatural power. The curse isn't just magical, it's psychological. Morgana designed it to force me to choose between consciousness and instinct, between vampire nature and animal survival. But you don't have to choose, Elena said, understanding flooding through her. The same way I learned that being a vampire doesn't negate being a healer. They're not opposing forces, they're integrated aspects of the same existence. For the first time since his revelation, Dimitri's mental voice carried genuine excitement. Exactly. But I needed someone who had successfully navigated that integration to help me find the path through Morgana's trap. Elena looked around her sanctuary with new eyes. This wasn't just a hidden veterinary clinic anymore, it was a laboratory for supernatural healing, a place where she'd unknowingly been developing techniques that might free the most powerful vampire in existence from a witch's revenge. The hope blazing in her chest no longer felt dangerous. It felt like destiny. Colonel Ionescu is the least of our problems, Elena said, surprising herself with her newfound confidence. We have a curse to break. The weight of Elena's declaration hung in the chamber like a physical presence, transforming the sterile medical space into something that felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. She moved through her equipment with renewed purpose, no longer organizing for escape, but preparing for something far more complex. Supernatural surgery on a level she'd never attempted. Breaking a witch's curse isn't like treating infected wounds or mending broken bones, Elena said, her hands sorting through vials of medicines and mystical compounds she'd collected over centuries. If Morgana Blackthorn is as powerful as vampire legends claim, she would have woven safeguards into the binding, traps for anyone attempting to reverse her work. Dimitri's wolf form remained perfectly still, but his mental voice carried grim agreement. She's had 3 years to monitor the curse's effects, to strengthen it against interference. Every failed attempt I've made to transform has only reinforced the barriers between my consciousness and vampiric abilities. Elena paused, a crystalline vial of her own refined blood catching the chamber's harsh lighting. Then we can't approach this as a direct assault on the curse itself. We need to work around it, find the spaces where Morgana's binding doesn't reach. The connection between us, Dimitri said suddenly. When you've fed me your blood, when you've channeled healing energy, I've felt something shift. Not transformation, but a loosening of the barriers, as if your life force creates static in the curse's frequency. The observation sent Elena's analytical mind racing through possibilities. She'd always known that her healing abilities were unusual, that her vampiric nature somehow enhanced rather than corrupted her connection to living essence. But if that unique integration could actually interfere with complex magical bindings, I need to examine you more thoroughly, Elena said, gathering specialized instruments she'd never thought to use on a patient of Dimitri's caliber. Not just your physical condition, but the supernatural signatures, The way the curse interacts with your vampiric nature, where the magical barriers are strongest. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 centuries of hiding from vampire society, and now she was preparing to perform unprecedented supernatural healing on its most powerful ruler. But the fear that would have paralyzed her days ago felt distant now, overshadowed by scientific curiosity and something deeper, something that felt uncomfortably like personal investment. Elena, Dimitri's mental voice carried warning. Before we begin, you should understand the risks you're accepting. Morgana designed this curse to destroy me slowly, but she would have included consequences for anyone attempting interference. If we proceed, you become a target for witch magic that has had years to mature and strengthen. Elena's hands stilled on her instruments, the reminder of danger cutting through her growing confidence. She'd spent 3 centuries in careful isolation specifically to avoid supernatural conflicts that could spiral beyond her control. Witch magic operated by different rules than vampire abilities, drawing power from sources she barely understood. But when she looked at Dimitri, really looked at him, she saw more than just the vampire king trapped by enemy magic. She saw the creature who had comforted her when she'd faced governmental exposure, who had spoken of her choices with respect rather than judgment, who had searched for decades to find someone capable of understanding his predicament. She saw someone worth the risk. Colonel Ionescu and her operatives already marked me as a supernatural threat, Elena said, surprising herself with how steady her voice remained. Morgana Blackthorn can join the list of entities interested in my continued existence. I've been hiding long enough. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, abandoning the safety of anonymity for something terrifyingly uncertain. But as the words left her lips, Elena realized they carried the ring of truth she'd been avoiding for decades. Her isolation hadn't been protection. It had been cowardice disguised as caution. The other wolves, she continued, gesturing toward her remaining patients. They'll need protection during the process. If breaking the curse requires the level of magical intervention, I suspect, there could be side effects. Dimitri's golden eyes tracked to his pack, and Elena caught a flicker of emotion in his mental voice that might have been affection. They followed me into the mountains when the curse took hold. Ordinary wolves accepting a vampire consciousness as their alpha. They deserve better than to suffer for my battles. The genuine concern for creatures he'd known for mere years struck Elena as profoundly revealing. Whatever else the vampire king might be, whatever ruthless decisions his position required, he possessed capacity for loyalty and protection that extended beyond political necessity. Elena moved closer, her enhanced senses reading the complex, supernatural signatures surrounding Dimitri's cursed form. The magical bindings were more intricate than anything she'd encountered, layers upon layers of witchcraft designed to prevent exactly the kind of intervention she was contemplating. But beneath Morgana's work, she could sense something else, the fundamental vampiric essence that made Dimitri what he was, trapped but not destroyed. Still present, still powerful, simply inaccessible. "We're going to need help," Elena said quietly. "Breaking a curse this complex will require more than medical knowledge and healing abilities. We need someone who understands witch magic from the inside." Dimitri's mental voice carried dark amusement. "Then it's fortunate that the Vampire King has access to resources beyond mountain sanctuaries." Elena felt her pulse quicken as she realized the implications. This was no longer about hiding in the wilderness, treating injured animals in secret. This was about stepping into the supernatural world's center stage, accepting allies and enemies she'd spent centuries avoiding. The final confrontation wasn't approaching, it was here. The words hung between them, like a challenge issued to fate itself. Elena felt the familiar sensation of crossing a threshold from which there could be no return, but this time the terror was accompanied by something she hadn't experienced in centuries: anticipation. "What resources?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would reshape everything she thought she understood about vampire politics. "Katerina Volkov," Dmitri replied, his mental voice carrying layers of complicated history. "My court's liaison to supernatural entities outside vampire hierarchy. She's been tracking my disappearance for 3 years, following leads across Eastern Europe. More importantly, she owes significant debts to a witch coven in Prague, debts that could be leveraged into cooperation." Elena's enhanced senses detected something in Dmitri's tone that suggested Katerina Volkov represented more than just political convenience. "Someone you trust." "Someone I trust to prioritize my survival over her personal safety, yes, though I suspect she'll have opinions about my methods of remaining hidden." Despite the gravity of their situation, Elena found herself curious about the vampire court dynamics she'd avoided for so long. The idea that even the vampire king maintained relationships complex enough to warrant careful navigation struck her as oddly humanizing. But before she could pursue that line of thought, a new sound echoed through the sanctuary's upper levels, the distinctive whine of helicopter rotors cutting through mountain wind. Elena's blood froze. "Ionescu, she's returning with reinforcements." Every wolf in the chamber lifted their heads simultaneously, supernatural senses detecting the approaching threat. But instead of panic, Elena felt Dmitri's consciousness project calm authority through whatever pack bond he'd established with the animals. "How long before they reach the lower levels?" Dmitri asked. Elena closed her eyes, calculating based on the sanctuary's layout and the operatives' previous approach patterns. 20 minutes, perhaps 30 if they proceed cautiously. They'll expect resistance this time. Then we accelerate the timeline. Dmitri's mental voice carried the decisive authority of someone accustomed to making critical decisions under pressure. "Katerina will need to reach us before the operatives force a confrontation. You can contact her from here?" Elena moved toward her communication equipment, then stopped as she realized the absurdity of the question. Of course, Vampire King, ancient mental abilities. 3,000 years of existence develop certain communication networks. Elena caught a flicker of amusement in Dmitri's response. "Though I'll admit coordinating supernatural politics from wolf form has presented unique challenges." Elena felt herself smiling despite their circumstances, a response that would have been impossible days ago when her world consisted of hidden medical work and careful isolation. Now, facing governmental operatives and witch curses simultaneously, she discovered reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. The helicopter sounds grew closer, accompanied by the distant rumble of ground vehicles. Ionescu wasn't taking chances with a second approach. "Lena." Dmitri's mental voice carried sudden urgency. "Before Katerina arrives, before the operatives force our hand, you need to understand what you're accepting. Breaking this curse will reveal your abilities to vampire courts across continents. Your 3 centuries of anonymity end the moment we succeed." Elena paused in her preparations, the weight of that reality settling over her like a physical presence. Everything she'd built in this sanctuary, every careful choice that had allowed her to practice healing while avoiding supernatural politics, all of it would become impossible once vampire society knew her true capabilities. But as she looked around the chamber, seeing the wolves who had found safety under her care, seeing Dmitri who had searched decades to find someone capable of understanding his predicament, Elena realized her isolation had already ended. The question wasn't whether to abandon anonymity, but whether to embrace the consequences with courage or cowardice. 3 centuries ago, I became a vampire because I was dying and desperate to continue healing, she said, her voice carrying newfound certainty. I've spent every year since then trying to prove that vampiric nature doesn't negate the choice to preserve life. If revealing those abilities to vampire courts means other supernatural entities can benefit from what I've learned, then perhaps exposure isn't catastrophe. Perhaps it's responsibility. The admission felt like shedding armor she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Elena moved to her most complex medical instruments, devices she'd modified over decades to work with supernatural physiology, and began configuring them for the most challenging case of her lengthy career. "Katerina will arrive within the hour," Dmitri announced. "She's intrigued by the prospect of meeting the legendary healer who's been treating the Vampire King like a common patient." Elena's hands stilled on her equipment. "Legendary? Elena, did you truly believe that 3 centuries of supernatural healing work would go unnoticed by vampire courts? Your reputation has been growing for decades. I simply represent the first case desperate enough to seek you out directly." The helicopter rotors grew deafening, then suddenly cut to silence. Ionescu's forces had landed. The final test was beginning. The silence that followed the helicopter's landing felt more ominous than the rotor noise itself. Elena's enhanced hearing tracked the coordinated movements above, boots on metal, whispered commands, the distinctive click of weapons being checked. Ionescu had brought a full tactical team. 12 operatives, Elena whispered, her vampiric senses cataloguing heartbeats and breathing patterns. Military-grade equipment. They're setting up a perimeter. Dmitri's massive wolf form rose from his resting position, golden eyes reflecting the chamber's harsh lighting with predatory intensity. Through their mental link, Elena felt his consciousness shift, not toward the animal instincts that had been consuming him, but toward something far more dangerous, the tactical mind of a ruler who had survived 1,000 years of supernatural warfare. "They'll breach the main entrance first," he projected. "Standard protocol. Force us toward the deeper chambers where they assume we'll be trapped." Elena moved to her security monitors, watching black-clad figures descend into her sanctuary with efficient precision. Colonel Ionescu led the advance, her face set in grim determination that spoke of personal vendetta rather than mere duty. "She's not here for capture anymore," Elena realized with cold certainty. "This is termination." The first explosion shattered through the upper levels, a controlled blast designed to collapse Elena's primary escape routes. The message was clear: no retreat, no negotiation, no survival. But as the sound echoed through the chambers, Elena felt something unexpected rising in her chest. Not the paralyzing fear that had defined her centuries of hiding, but a burning fury that surprised her with its intensity. These operatives weren't just threatening her existence. They were destroying the sanctuary she'd built to heal creatures that had nowhere else to turn. "They're killing my patients," she said, her voice carrying an edge that would have been impossible days ago. Through the monitors, Elena watched tactical teams systematically destroying her medical equipment in the upper levels, shooting tranquilizer darts into the wolves that couldn't retreat fast enough. Creatures she'd nursed back to health were collapsing, their trust in her protection becoming their vulnerability. The rage that flooded through Elena's vampiric nature felt like awakening from a 300-year sleep. "Katerina is 2 minutes out," Dmitri announced, his mental voice carrying approval at Elena's transformation. "But the operatives will reach us first." Elena turned from the monitors, her hands moving to weapons she'd hoped never to use, devices designed for supernatural combat, modified with her medical knowledge to be devastatingly effective. The healer, who had spent centuries preserving life, was preparing to destroy it. "The curse," she said suddenly. "Breaking it now, under combat conditions, will be exponentially more dangerous," Dmitri finished. "But also our only chance. I cannot protect you in this form, and you cannot face 12 trained operatives alone." The sound of approaching boots echoed through the lower corridors. Ionescu's forces had found the main access to the deep chambers. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment. 3 centuries of careful isolation, destroyed in days, a hidden sanctuary about to become a battlefield, a healing practice built on secrecy, now requiring supernatural warfare for survival. But when she opened her eyes and looked at Dmitri, at the Vampire King, who had sought her out not for political advantage, but for healing, who had trusted her with vulnerabilities that could destroy him, Elena felt the last of her hesitation burn away. "Tell me exactly what I need to do," she said, moving toward the most dangerous medical equipment she possessed. Dimitri's response carried centuries of command authority compressed into mental urgency. The curse anchors in 3 binding points: consciousness, physical form, and supernatural essence. You'll need to sever each connection simultaneously while channeling enough of your life force to bridge the gaps Morgana created. And if I make a mistake, then both the Vampire King and his healer die tonight. The first gunshots rang through the corridors, not targeting them yet, but clearing obstacles, announcing imminent arrival. Elena estimated 90 seconds before the tactical teams reached their chamber. She placed her hands on the specialized instruments she'd configured for supernatural surgery, feeling their complex mechanisms respond to her vampiric energy. Around the chamber, the remaining wolves formed a protective circle, their pack instincts recognizing the approaching battle. Elena. Dimitri's mental voice carried something she'd never heard from him before, uncertainty tinged with what might have been affection. "Whatever happens, you should know that finding you has been worth 3 years of searching." The admission hit her with unexpected force, a reminder that beneath the tactical necessities and supernatural politics, something genuine had developed between them, something that made the approaching confrontation feel personal rather than merely strategic. Elena met Dimitri's golden gaze, seeing both the trapped king and the creature who had comforted her through governmental exposure. "Then let's make sure this isn't where the story ends." The chamber doors exploded inward as Ionescu's operatives breached the final barrier. The battle for Elena's survival and Dimitri's freedom had begun. The explosion shattered Elena's world into fragments of metal and stone, but her hands never wavered from the surgical instruments. As tactical operatives poured through the breach, she began the most dangerous procedure of her 3-century career, breaking a witch's curse while under direct fire. "Maintain the circle." Dimitri's mental command echoed through the pack consciousness, and the remaining wolves threw themselves at the advancing soldiers with suicidal courage. Elena heard gunshots, yelps of pain, the wet sound of claws meeting flesh, but she couldn't look away from the delicate work before her. The first binding point, consciousness, required precision that seemed impossible amid the chaos. Elena's vampiric senses guided her instruments through layers of magical interference, while Colonel Ionescu's voice cut through the battle noise. "Target the woman! The wolf is secondary!" A bullet shattered the medical monitor beside Elena's head, spraying her with glass and sparks. She felt the sting, smelled her own blood, but her hands continued their work. The consciousness binding was weakening, Dimitri's human awareness struggling toward the surface of his wolf form. The shout came from the chamber entrance, not an operative's voice, but something older, carrying supernatural authority. Through the smoke and chaos, Elena glimpsed a tall woman with silver hair moving through the battle like death incarnate. Katerina Volkov had arrived. The vampire court's liaison fought with elegance that bordered on artistry, each movement flowing into the next as she dismantled Ionescu's tactical formation. But even supernatural reflexes couldn't protect them indefinitely against military-grade weapons and superior numbers. Elena reached the second binding point, physical form, and felt the curse's resistance spike violently. Morgana's magic fought back like a living thing, sending waves of agony through Elena's nervous system that threatened to shatter her concentration. The instruments in her hands grew burning hot, responding to the supernatural conflict by channeling more of her life force than any vampire should willingly sacrifice. "The transformation is beginning," Katerina called out, ducking behind overturned medical equipment as bullets sparked off the metal surfaces. "Whatever you're doing, the magical signatures are destabilizing." Elena could feel it too, Dimitri's form beginning to shift, bones extending, muscle mass redistributing in ways that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. But the process was wrong, too fast, pulling energy from sources that couldn't sustain the change. It was pulling energy from her. The realization hit Elena with crystalline clarity. Breaking the curse wouldn't just reveal her abilities to vampire courts. It would consume them entirely. Morgana had designed the magical bindings to feed on any healing energy that tried to counteract them. Elena wasn't just risking exposure or injury. She was trading her vampiric essence for Dimitri's freedom. 3 centuries of accumulated power, the supernatural abilities that had made her legendary among vampire courts, the enhanced healing that had saved countless lives, all of it would be gone. She would survive the process, but as something fundamentally diminished, a vampire stripped of the very gifts that defined her purpose. Colonel Ionescu appeared in Elena's peripheral vision, sidestepping Katerina's defenses with the mechanical precision of someone accepting their own death as mission cost. Her weapon aimed directly at Elena's head, finger tightening on the trigger. Elena had perhaps 2 seconds to make a choice that would determine every moment of her remaining existence. She could stop the procedure, preserve her abilities, fight for survival using the supernatural gifts she'd spent centuries developing. Dimitri would remain trapped. Morgana's curse would continue consuming him slowly, but Elena would retain the power to heal others who might seek her aid in future decades. Or she could complete the binding severance, sacrifice everything that made her extraordinary, and trust that love, an emotion she'd barely acknowledged between them, was worth the price of her supernatural identity. Elena looked into Dimitri's golden eyes, seeing past the wolf form to the consciousness fighting desperately toward freedom. She thought of 3 years he'd searched for her, of the genuine affection in his mental voice, of the way he'd protected her wolves even while trapped by magic he couldn't control. She thought of 3 centuries spent hiding from connection, choosing isolation over vulnerability, safety over purpose. "I love you," she whispered, too quietly for anyone but Dimitri to hear through their mental link. Then Elena channeled every remaining fragment of her vampiric essence into the final binding point. The supernatural explosion that followed shattered every piece of equipment in the chamber, sent operatives flying against stone walls, and reduced Morgana's carefully crafted curse to wisps of dissipating magical energy. When the light faded and the echoes stopped, Dmitri Kozlov stood in his true form for the first time in 3 years, tall, dangerous, radiating the accumulated power of a 1,000-year reign. And Elena collapsed to the chamber floor, her vampiric nature gutted, her healing abilities gone, her 3 centuries of accumulated strength sacrificed for a love she'd discovered too late to question. The cost of victory was everything she'd been. The question was whether what remained would be enough. The silence that followed felt more profound than death itself. Elena lay crumpled on the stone floor, her body trembling from the aftershocks of supernatural energy expenditure. Every breath burned through lungs that no longer processed oxygen with vampiric efficiency. Her enhanced senses, the acute hearing that had tracked heartbeats through walls, the night vision that had pierced absolute darkness, the healing touch that had saved countless lives, all of it was gone, leaving her feeling hollow as an abandoned shell. But she was alive, diminished, fundamentally altered, but alive. Dimitri knelt beside her within seconds, his movements carrying the fluid grace of someone reacquainted with human form after 3 years of lupine limitations. His hands, no longer paws, Elena noted with distant wonder, touched her face with reverence that bordered on worship. "Elena." His voice was deeper than she'd imagined from their mental communications, carrying accent traces of a dozen European countries. "What have you done?" Around them, the chamber bore witness to supernatural devastation. Colonel Ionescu and her surviving operatives lay unconscious against the stone walls, their tactical equipment smoking from magical overload. Several of Elena's wolves whimpered softly, injured but alive, while others approached cautiously to investigate their pack leader's transformation. Katerina Volkov emerged from behind the destroyed medical equipment, her silver hair disheveled, but her expression sharp with political calculation. "The magical signatures," she said, studying Elena with newfound intensity. "They've completely dissipated. She's no longer registering as supernatural." Elena tried to sit up, her body responding with purely human limitations that felt alien after 3 centuries. Dimitri's hands supported her, his strength now devastating rather than restrained. She could see him clearly despite the chamber's dim lighting, not through vampiric night vision, but because his skin carried a subtle luminescence that spoke of power fully restored. "The curse is broken," Elena managed, her voice hoarse from the supernatural exertion. "Completely severed. Morgana's binding points have been destroyed." "At what cost?" Dimitri's fingers traced the lines of exhaustion around her eyes, and Elena realized he could feel the absence of her vampiric nature as tangibly as she could. "You sacrificed everything." The weight of that reality settled over Elena like physical pressure. 3 centuries of accumulated abilities, gone. The enhanced healing that had made her legendary among supernatural courts vanished. The vampiric strength that had allowed her to single-handedly maintain this sanctuary depleted entirely. She was, for all practical purposes, human again. But as Elena looked into Dimitri's eyes, golden still, but now expressing emotions that lupine features had been unable to convey, she felt something unexpected rising in her chest. Not regret or mourning for what she'd lost, but a strange sense of completion. For 300 years, she'd used her supernatural abilities to hide from genuine connection. Now, stripped of every enhancement that had defined her identity, she was forced to confront what remained. It was worth it, she said, and meant it completely. Dimitri's expression transformed, vulnerability replacing the careful control that had characterized their mental communications. "Elena, you don't understand what you've given up. The vampire courts, the political implications. Without your supernatural abilities, you have no protection from—" "She has mine." Dimitri's words carried the absolute authority of someone accustomed to reshaping reality through declaration alone. Elena felt the weight of that protection settle around her like armor, the promise of the vampire king himself guaranteeing her safety. Katerina stepped closer, her political instincts clearly processing the ramifications. "A human, under direct royal protection," she mused. "The courts will find this unprecedented." Elena struggled to her feet, Dimitri's hands steadying her as her human balance readjusted to movement without supernatural grace. Around the chamber, her wolves watched with intelligent eyes, their pack instincts recognizing changed dynamics, but maintaining their trust in her leadership. "The sanctuary," Elena said suddenly, the practical implications hitting her with crushing force. "Without my abilities, I can't maintain the medical equipment, can't treat supernatural injuries." "You can learn new methods," Dimitri interrupted. "Human medicine has advanced considerably in recent decades, and you'll have resources now. Royal protection includes royal funding." Colonel Ionescu stirred against the far wall, her consciousness returning with military efficiency despite the supernatural trauma. Elena watched the woman assess the transformed situation with the pragmatic acceptance of someone whose mission parameters had fundamentally changed. "The government investigation," Elena said, meeting Ionescu's gaze across the destroyed chamber. "My exposure will be managed," Katerina interjected smoothly. "Certain governmental departments have long-standing agreements with vampire courts regarding supernatural incidents. This will be classified as a contained magical anomaly." Elena felt laughter bubbling up from her chest, not hysteria, but genuine amusement at the absurdity of her transformation. 3 days ago, she'd been a hidden healer desperate to avoid exposure. Now she was a human under royal vampire protection, her sanctuary officially recognized by both supernatural and governmental authorities. Everything had changed. Everything she'd feared had come to pass. And somehow, impossibly, she had never felt more herself. 3 weeks later, Elena stood at the entrance to her sanctuary, watching the morning sun paint the Carpathian peaks in shades of gold and amber. The sight struck her differently now, not with the resigned tolerance of a vampire enduring daylight, but with the pure appreciation of someone who could finally experience beauty without supernatural filters distorting her perception. Her body ached with purely human fatigue from the previous night's work. Without vampiric endurance, treating 15 injured wolves had pushed her to physical limits she'd forgotten existed. but the exhaustion felt clean, earned through effort rather than supernatural expenditure. "You're different," Dmitri said, emerging from the sanctuary's main corridor with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. The simple domesticity of the gesture still surprised Elena. The Vampire King performing mundane tasks because his human partner needed warmth and caffeine to function. Different how? Elena accepted the mug gratefully, her hands wrapping around the ceramic for heat her body could no longer generate efficiently. Content. Dmitri settled beside her on the stone steps, his supernatural nature allowing him comfort in the morning cold that now required Elena to bundle in wool sweaters. "For 3 centuries you carried guilt like a physical weight. It's gone now." Elena considered this, watching steam rise from her coffee into the crystalline air. He was right, though she hadn't consciously recognized the change. The persistent ache of self-recrimination that had driven her into isolation, the conviction that her vampiric nature made her fundamentally unworthy of connection, had simply disappeared. "Maybe because I finally did something that required genuine sacrifice," she said, not hiding behind supernatural abilities, but choosing to give them up for something more important. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted her reflection. A convoy of black SUVs wound up the mountain road toward the sanctuary, not the aggressive formation of Colonel Ionescu's tactical teams, but the measured procession of an official delegation. "Katerina," Dmitri identified, his enhanced senses reading the vehicle's occupants long before Elena's human perception could distinguish details. With representatives from 3 European vampire courts, if the magical signatures are accurate. Elena felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety, then forced herself to breathe through the reaction, coming to assess the damage to their political calculations. "Coming to witness something unprecedented," Dmitri corrected. "A vampire who voluntarily relinquished supernatural power for love. The courts are curious about the implications." The convoy reached the sanctuary's main entrance, and Elena watched Katerina emerge from the lead vehicle with her characteristic efficiency. Behind her came figures Elena recognized from centuries of careful avoidance, court liaisons whose political games she'd spent lifetimes evading. But as they approached, Elena realized her perspective had shifted fundamentally. Without vampiric abilities to hide behind, she had no choice but meet them as herself, not as a legendary healer or supernatural asset, but as someone who had chosen love over power and found peace in that decision. "Dr. Varga," Katerina greeted her formally, though Elena caught warmth beneath the professional courtesy. "The courts have reached consensus regarding your unique circumstances." "Which are?" Elena asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Official recognition of your sanctuary as a royal protectorate," one of the court representatives announced. "Funded through vampire resources, staffed with supernatural medical specialists, but maintaining your leadership and treatment philosophy." Elena blinked, processing the implications. "They want me to continue my work?" "They want to understand how someone who sacrificed everything for another's freedom approaches healing," Katerina clarified. "Your medical techniques were legendary before your transformation. Your motivations are apparently even more intriguing afterward." "And there's something else," Dmitri added, his hand finding Elena's with casual possessiveness that made several court representatives exchange meaningful glances. "Show them, Katerina." The liaison produced a folder containing official documents bearing governmental seals Elena recognized. "Complete pardons for any previous legal complications," Katerina explained. "Your sanctuary is now classified as an official wildlife rehabilitation center with special provisions for unusual species." Elena laughed, the same genuine amusement that had surprised her in the underground chamber, but deeper now, seasoned with 3 weeks of discovering who she was without supernatural enhancement. 3 centuries of hiding," she said, meeting each court representative's gaze in turn, "all because I was afraid of being seen as I actually am." "And how do you see yourself now?" Katerina asked, with what seemed like genuine curiosity. Elena looked around the sanctuary, at the wolves emerging from their dens to investigate the visitors. at Dimitri, whose presence had transformed her understanding of connection, at the morning light, illuminating a world she'd finally stopped hiding from. "As someone who spent too long mistaking isolation for safety," she said, "and who's ready to discover what healing looks like when it comes from choice rather than obligation." The court representatives exchanged glances that spoke of political calculations Elena no longer needed to decipher or fear. She was human now, vulnerable, mortal, limited. She had never been more powerful. The court delegation departed within the hour, leaving behind contracts that would transform Elena's hidden sanctuary into something she'd never dared imagine, a legitimate bridge between human and supernatural worlds. As the convoy disappeared down the mountain road, Elena felt the peculiar lightness that came from no longer carrying secrets that had defined her existence for centuries. "Regrets?" Dimitri asked, settling beside her on the stone steps where they'd watched the morning unfold into bureaucratic revelation. Elena considered the question seriously. Her human body registered the mountain cold with sharp immediacy, demanding the wool cloak draped around her shoulders. Her mundane senses caught only fragments of the forest sounds that had once created symphonies in her vampiric perception. The healing touch that had made her legendary was gone, replaced by purely human medical knowledge that felt inadequate by comparison. "None," she said, and discovered the truth of it in speaking. "For the first time in 3 centuries, I know exactly who I am without supernatural abilities defining my worth." A low howl echoed from the sanctuary's interior, not distress but communication. The pack was settling into their afternoon rest, their injuries from the previous week's government raid healing under care that relied on human medicine supplemented by supernatural resources Dimitri's royal status provided. Elena had learned to work with limitations again and found unexpected satisfaction in treatments that required skill rather than innate vampiric power. "The specialists Katerina mentioned," Elena said, reviewing the morning's agreements. "Other supernatural healers willing to work under human oversight. I never imagined such collaboration was possible." "Many things become possible when fear stops dictating choices," Dimitri observed. His fingers traced patterns on her palm with the unconscious affection that had developed over their weeks together. "Your transformation changed more than your supernatural status. It demonstrated that power voluntarily sacrificed for love carries different weight than power simply accumulated." Elena understood his meaning. The court representatives hadn't come to assess political damage, but to witness someone who had chosen vulnerability over strength and found herself more complete than ever. Her decision to break his curse at the cost of her vampiric nature had created ripples through supernatural society that was still expanding. The sanctuary's communication system chimed, a human technology that had replaced her supernatural awareness of approaching visitors. Elena checked the display, expecting supply deliveries or medical consultations. Instead, she found requests from healers across 3 countries, both human and supernatural, seeking to understand her integration techniques. Word of her transformation had spread beyond vampire courts into broader communities Elena hadn't known existed. "They want to learn," she said with wonder, scrolling through messages from veterinarians treating supernatural animals, human doctors working with vampire patients, magical healers curious about mundane medical advances. "Not use my abilities, but understand my methods." "You've become something unprecedented," Dimitri said. "A healer who bridges worlds not through supernatural power, but through choice to see beyond traditional boundaries." A familiar weight settled against Elena's legs. Alexei, the black wolf who'd been her first rescue years ago. His intelligence remained sharp despite his lupine form, and his presence had become Elena's anchor during the adjustment to human limitations. Other pack members emerged from their afternoon shelter, drawn by the contentment their human leader projected despite her transformation. Elena scratched behind Alexei's ears, her human touch less precise than vampiric sensitivity, but no less caring. I spent centuries believing connection required supernatural bonds, she said, watching her pack arrange themselves in the courtyard with the easy trust of animals who felt genuinely safe. Fear of losing that kept me isolated when what I really needed was courage to connect as myself. Dimitri's hand covered hers, his supernatural warmth a comfort her human body craved. And now? Elena looked across her sanctuary, at the medical facilities that would soon house both human and supernatural equipment, at the wolves who taught her that healing came from understanding rather than power, at the man whose cursed existence had cost her everything supernatural, while giving her something immeasurably more valuable. Now I understand why love requires vulnerability, she said. I could never have truly connected to anyone while hiding behind abilities that made me feel superior to genuine emotion. The afternoon sun shifted, casting long shadows across the Carpathian landscape Elena had called home for years, but was only now learning to truly inhabit. Without vampiric nature demanding she avoid daylight, she could appreciate the full cycle of mountain light, dawn's promise, noon's clarity, evening's gentle transition into star-filled darkness. "What comes next?" Dimitri asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. Elena smiled, feeling certainty that had nothing to do with supernatural foresight and everything to do with choices made from love rather than fear. "We build something new, a place where healing happens through understanding rather than power, where both human and supernatural beings learn that connection transcends the boundaries we've spent centuries maintaining." She was human now, fragile, mortal, limited by physical constraints she'd forgotten existed. She had never been more ready to change the world.